Interestingly enough, this came out in the editorial of the Manila Standard. It is looking at the PDAF controversy as an opportunity for the court to reassert itself against the other branches of government. Because now the other branches of government are embroiled in this problem, and they're not looking too hot either in the public's eye. And now we're all looking at the Supreme Court. And maybe in this way, if they do it the right way, then perhaps they can recover whatever they lost, whatever esteem they lost, and then they can be elevated again in the eyes of the public. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. But then, I said all of this already, right? But the court cannot, I think every time it dips in popularity, it's when it tries to ignore what the law says and then tries to decide cases based on politics. Now, we've read enough cases by the Marcos Supreme Court. And we can see back then how anything can be legally possible. Now, we fixed that with the Constitution after we deposed Mr. Marcos. Then Mrs. Arroyo comes in with her own set of legal issues, and we see a Supreme Court that can justify any legal argument, even if it violates, in my view, common sense. Now, if the court wants to regain the prestige it had before 1973, then it has to start doing things again the way it used to. You have to have the more intelligent justices or people appointed to the court and then actually decide cases in accordance with what the law says, not to please the powers that be, not to please the appointing power. The second thing I asked you to read for constitutional law was this chapter from Peter Irons' book. Remember? No, you don't, but it's okay. That's why I put it back here again. It talks about Brown versus Board of Education and how, during oral arguments, the state of Arkansas actually had the temerity to argue that, we're not sure if Brown versus Board of Education is law in Arkansas. And you should say that, and the Chief Justice says that. I have never heard anyone make that kind of an argument in any court, and I'm old enough, I've handled so many cases. But when we make a ruling, and if you know the Constitution, that means that our ruling forms part of the law of the land. I think the court can do that only if it has moral ascendancy. If in the eyes of the public, it is not captured by any political interests. So when Justice Warren explodes and puts that lawyer in his place, that is part of the prestige that we do not have. It has to regain command and say, that's wrong, and then everyone should follow. But the fact is, it doesn't have that sort of thing anymore. It's interesting because especially for your batch, when you came in, the case is already different. 2 years ago, it would have been even in a basic course like constitutional law and legal method, it would have been mostly pro-Aquino, a very strong court. That's what you would see in the media. That was what you would read in your cases. Right now, it's not. It's kind of, placid, for lack of a better term. I love that last line. Former California governor, now wore a black robe, would not tolerate this challenge to his authority. And I think for us to say that the legal system works, that the rule of law exists in this country, they have to be able to act in that way. To say, you're wrong, I am the Supreme Court, do as I say. There should never be any doubt that everyone will follow you, even if they disagree. Even if they disagree with your ruling. That's the sign that the system works. I disagreed a lot with many Supreme Court decisions. You know that, you've read my work. And if you read even more of it, you would know, if you read all my work, you would think, my God, the Supreme Court has never decided a correct decision, ever. But I've never said, do not follow the court. Never, I think. I have to check. But legally, see, I do not understand what the Reyes camp is thinking, because ultimately, this case goes back to the Supreme Court. I do not understand why, unless they were thinking that once you occupy a position, it would be harder to remove the Reyes. Occupation is 99% of the law in this case, I guess. Because ultimately, the case should go back to the Supreme Court in many ways. Let us assume the HRET starts hearings on this case. Velasco being a party, right, can challenge the jurisdiction of the HRET. HRET will say, no, we have jurisdiction. Velasco can bring that decision to the Supreme Court and say abuse of discretion by HRET. It has to go back. Even if they make a ruling on the merits and they say, we have jurisdiction and we find that Reyes is qualified to be a member of the House of Representatives because she satisfies the requirements of the Constitution, Velasquez can bring that question back to the Supreme Court and say abuse of discretion, and there is no way this case cannot go back to the Supreme Court. And that's when the opportunity, I think, for the court will arise. I think even if there was undue haste in the decision of Reyes, if the case goes back to the Supreme Court and then they make a ruling, on the merits, a very well-reasoned decision, there is no way, there's nothing else for the House to do but to follow it. I think that's why initially when we talked about this in class, my instinct was, and I blurted this out and I'm trying to remember why I said it, I think the House doesn't want it to go back to the Supreme Court because in the end, if the court makes a final decision on this case, they would have no choice but to follow what the court says. Or else, they would be guilty of triggering a constitutional crisis. But I don't see how legally they can prevent it from going back. The HRET, the case before the HRET is pending. That means it has to be resolved. And because it has to be resolved, a decision has to come from the HRET, which will be vulnerable to judicial review if Velasco argues that there's abuse of discretion. So even on a tactical plane, from a tactical point of view, I don't see it. They're missing slides here. I don't know what happened. There's a question, of course, in the press as to how Velasco can be impeached. Justice Velasco can be impeached when he refused to participate in the case. And then the lawyer for Reyes, one Professor Harry Roque, said that, is he here? He's not here? Okay. He said that it's clear from Justice Brion's dissent that the Supreme Court rushed the decision to favor Justice Velasco's son. I've read the dissent. I don't see that. I see 2 points made by Justice Brion in his dissent that are probably significant. One is that they could have waited for, or they could have asked all the parties to file their position papers, which it didn't. And two, that the court's ruling it's enough that there should be a pronouncement, proclamation of the winner for jurisdiction to be removed from the COMELEC and to go to HRET. But it's a dissent. But I do not see a basis for impeaching Justice Velasquez on the dissent. So knowing Professor Roque, it's probably meant to intimidate. It's not really a serious legal strategy. I think I might have to talk to him about it, but I just don't see how it's going to work. He recused himself. And then you're going to prove that, no, but you used your influence to get the majority to side with your son. Good luck with that one. I don't see how that's going to work. No, did I do anything? Yes. See, in either case, it will go back to the Supreme Court. Unless the court says, well, political events have overtaken this case, and we don't think we should decide it again. But if the court does that, then it will bury itself even more compared to the other branches of government. And then no one will respect it. They have no choice. They have to. This is the case. This is the case where they have to stand up and say, remember us, equal branch of government? This is the way. This is the one that they can do it in. Stand its ground. That is. The Supreme Court's job is not to beat the House. It's not to say, hey, we're better than you. It has to explain its role the way it did in Angara versus Electoral Commission and say, look, this is not about judicial supremacy. We're following what the Constitution says, and our job is to interpret what the law says. And this is when you need great justices. Right? Great justices are few and far between. Their job, I think, is to illuminate the issue, enlighten the public, and move the country forward. If you ever become a justice, can you put that in your office so you remember what your function is? And now, if you're going to sink into politics and say, and have, fisticuffs with the House. It will lose for many reasons, right? The budget, impeachment. There is no way they can win if they have a brawl with Congress. So you need an enlightened decision to follow this one. And I think if it does that, then the House will have no choice but to bow. And if that happens, I will have faith that we are on our way to restoring the balance of power in government. Right now, it's not. And I kind of feel bad for the court. I've never seen it in a position like this. I'm sure we called on Justice Del Castillo to resign, sure. But we didn't call him names. We just pointed out the fact that he might have lifted some passages. But that compared to the language that Reyes is using, I wouldn't have signed that one. I wouldn't have gone along with that one. But the fact that you can talk to a justice like that now, and even if it's Velasco, who's really not the most popular one, shows there's something going on here. More than the legal aspects. Ultimately, the goal should be the rule of law. Once we lose that one, then there's no point in government. That even if you disagree with an institution so much, our ultimate job is to make sure they all do their jobs correctly. We don't call for the abolition of Congress, right? I mean, some people are, but I don't think they're serious. What we want is Congress to tell us how exactly the money is being used. Not for them to say, well, you're useless institution. We should just cut you out from government and have just a court and the executive. Of course not. Questions?